Um, I got a message from a friend who said that he found it engaging but a little bit depressing. So I think that's a fair assessment. So here's my blog post. I'm going to go ahead and read it. I begin with a quote from page 45 from the book. This is a story from 17th century England. It is also a story from 19th century Africa, and from 18th century South America, and from 20th century Indonesia and China and continental Europe. It's a story that is currently playing out in real time in northern India. It is the story of enclosure, the systematic concentration of land and resources in few hands, and has been one of the basic building blocks of the machine's rise in dominance since the pyramids were built. The enclosure process in early modern England was intimately linked with the rise and subsequent global dominance of modern capitalism. Taking away people's, quote, comfortable partial independence and substituting it with the, quote, precarious condition of mere hirelings has been the working basis of machine capitalism worldwide since the 1700s. A quick aside, I'm going to be thinking and writing about capitalism on the Protecting Veil blog, where I'm doing kind of a thematic book study. Here on Gadfly Academy, on Thursdays, we're doing the chronological book study, but then the thematic one will be on Monday evenings, also at 7:30. But it struck me that I have not contemplated capitalism sufficiently. And it's interesting when you look at the history of modern capitalism, it starts around the time of the schism. And it's obviously very closely tied to the rise of Protestantism. So I'm intrigued to look into it more. So I'll be writing about that if you're interested. So here's the rest of my chapter 5 kind of musings. Once the peasants who would become the proletariat had been forced off their land and wealth and power had been concentrated into a small number of hands, the preconditions for the Industrial Revolution were largely established. It's important to remember that the opposite of capitalism is not necessarily Marxism, socialism. There are many different ways to organize labor and governance, including subsistence economies, gift economies, commons-based systems, steady-state systems, and so on. And the capitalism and democracy that we know in the West is simply one of them. As such, it's worth taking an honest look at the history of modern capitalism, how it was built, what it replaced, and whether or not humanity is better off because of it. I'm not foolish enough to attempt to tackle all of this in one installment, however, so I will confine myself to a few observations. One of the great difficulties in conversations concerning things of this nature is that there is no agreed upon definition of what it means to be better off. From a utilitarian and materialist perspective, one could argue, and most modern folk do argue, that humanity as a whole is quote unquote better off now than we were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We are biased, of course, because we are advocating for the only world we know. And when we contemplate a less comfortable way of life, it's difficult for us to imagine that the people of the pre-industrial revolution world could possibly have been better off than we are. The problem, of course, is that we are the ones framing the conversation according to our criteria and our understanding of how the world works and our hierarchy of values. The reality is that trying to determine whether or not we are actually, quote unquote, better off than our ancestors is a fool's errand. There's no way to truly answer it except perhaps according to a very narrow group of criteria. What we can usefully consider are the negative and usually unforeseen consequences of capitalism as it has developed in the modern world. We live according to a series of modern myths that do not serve us or the world we live in well. The myth of progress, for example, has convinced us that the trajectory of human history is one of progress towards something better. And we can, quote unquote, prove this by pointing to the world we have created, revealing again the bias of our criteria and worldview. If the world is progressing, then there is no real need to change the path that we're on. The problem, of course, is that we know that there is a problem with the path that we're on. We are a rapacious people, unnecessarily over-consuming and wasting natural resources at an unsustainable rate. This is one of the main reasons that there is talk of terraforming Mars, Rather than focusing on living within our means, one solution, supposed solution of modern capitalism, is to colonize other planets where we can continue our overconsumption. Capitalism as we know it is certainly better than Soviet-style communism. That said, we can do better. As Kingsnorth noted in chapter 4, quote, growth has long become an end in itself, long divorced from any means. And as the wilderness writer Edward Abbey once pointed out, growth for growth's sake, ideology of the cancer cell, end quote. Capitalism bears within it this myth of infinite growth, and it is one that each of us can resist with the way we choose to live our daily lives. Buying local is not only usually a healthier choice, but it can also, is also a more ethical choice. Similarly, living more simply and learning to be content with one's clothing, aging car, etc., is a virtue that, if enough people practiced, could change the shape of the future and undermine the myth of infinite growth. So that's chapter 5. Let me see if there are any comments. Thomas, hello Thomas, watching from Tupelo, Mississippi. Prayers from St. Paul Orthodox Church. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome. Glad you're here. Steve Lenoris, I see capitalism as a natural economic system. Came about because of the awkwardness of barter. Coins, paper money, electronic credits are merely more convenient means of exchange. Yeah. Well, it was definitely part of the part of the puzzle, a piece in the puzzle. As I said, I'm particularly interested in the development, in looking closely at the development. I want to revisit Max Weber, who is probably a really good place to begin a study of the rise of capitalism. Hello, Arlene. Good evening. Steve does not have the book. All good. Charles, it's still in my Amazon cart. Well, hopefully it'll get to you eventually. It's definitely worth having and sharing and giving away. I'm going to be giving copies away, I think, at Christmas. Audrey, I have read the majority of it. I started skimming more as I neared the end. I think it was increasingly long-winded, but I would say I devoured the first half. I appreciate that. Yeah, you probably have more perspective than I. I can see how you might think that. That's feudalism, not capitalism, in my opinion. The barter system, you mean? Better off, whatever lends itself best to being truly human. Yes, yeah, indeed, and which is why a conversation about what it means to be a human is always one that's important. And as some of you may know, I was blogging about values, human values versus machine values before I started this book study, which is why I did that, because one has to have clarity in one's value system, and that obviously has a relation to what it means to be a human. Audrey, sorry, Steve, I don't think better off is a fool's errand. I know when I was worse off when I was better off. Yeah, well, mostly the fool's errand is trying to come to and to answer the question, what was it like for someone 500 years ago? Because obviously we come at it, there's no way of determining how content one person was, and then comparing someone 500 years ago with a corresponding person in our day. So trying to say definitively one way or the other, I guess that's my point. That said, I think it is a really important conversation to have, because I think most modern people assume that we're better off because we have all sorts of medical interventions, and we live longer lives. The question is, is it better to live 40 meaningful years, or 80 less meaningful years? And again, how can one determine that? But at least that kind of conversation, I think is greetings, Bruce. Glad you could join us. Gardening music, capitalism or crony capitalism? Capitalists are against crony capitalism. Also, is not the economic philosophy really the issue? Keynesian versus Hayek. I might have some better answers for you next week. I'm definitely not an economist or a political scientist. So I come at things more, if anything, more theologically and philosophically. I have a lot of reading to do, but I think it's a really important aspect of what Kingsnorth is talking about, and he kind of skips. I wouldn't say exactly skips over it. In my next section, I read some of the quotes from him pertaining to capitalism. But as with any book, you can only write about the things that you write about, and there are limits. But Father Jacob, I don't know if I gave you at all a helpful response, but yeah, I think human limits and human scale are both aspects, and that has to do with the mind, as well as the reason, rationality, as well as markets, and I think actually at the heart of a lot of this is asceticism and a sense of humility before God, before our created nature, which is limited, and the modern world, especially I think for the last 1,000 years, has been one of increasingly trying to break the limits. Steve, capitalism is producing products people need or want. It naturally expands because of the incentives, not perfect, but works because people act for selfish reasons, yet benefits those who consume. Capitalism, yeah, it produces things that people need. I think the problem is with the want part. Humans are pretty much insatiable, and that's one of the problems with capitalism. I think the United States, we're 5% of the world's population, and we consume 25%, I think, of the world's goods, natural resources. So if all the world consumed like we do in the United States, we'd have a real problem. I don't think it'd be possible. Obviously, there are limits to what consumption is possible, and also what consumption is healthy. And if that's one of the problems, is that if you have a system that is constantly focused on growth, and has no sense of limits, and if human desire is insatiable, you end up with a problem. And we're, I think, starting to see, and we will continue to see more and more of the problems. I think at the end of the day, it is a spiritual issue at root, and the solution is a spiritual one. Like I said, I think I'm looking at the idea of asceticism. I think that's an important aspect of human existence. Just the ability to control oneself, and humans have the capacity to do that. we have certain needs, but there's it's kind of a gray area, like how much do we actually need? Certainly, obviously not everyone needs to consume as much as Americans, because most of the world doesn't consume as much as Americans. Charles, so do you think it is incidental or is it coincidental that the technologies we now have emerged during the use of a predominantly capitalistic system? Uh, I don't think it's coincidental. Yeah, I don't think uh, I don't think the iPhone, would have been conceived of outside of a capitalist system. Um, it it was initially, it was another gadget. Obviously, the world existed and did just fine without the iPhone, without smartphones, up until 2007, and we would be fine without it. We would have been fine without the car, um, or the airplane. Things would have looked very different, and uh, probably better. Um, uh, we humans can only move, like, we have limits, and we are constantly pushing against those limits, and that's not necessarily a helpful thing. Doesn't necessarily improve our quality of life. um, but we have this kind of insatiable urge to constantly um, test limits, and we did that obviously with nuclear energy, and with the development of the nuclear bomb, which was not to our benefit. um, Arlene, Hong Kong in the 80s, they called it capitalism unleashed, no regard for human lives or the environment, no limit or rules. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it's a problem. It's a problem, and there does seem to be a connection in the West with capitalism, and like I said, in the rise of Protestantism, and so there's obviously there's going to be a mixed bag, but one of the things that Weber talks about is this idea that um, material success became an indicator of God's favor, which theologically, is very um, hard to defend, and especially, I mean, if you look at the Gospels, like, it, um, but if you have if you have millions of people that think this way, um, then you've got a spiritual. This system has kind of a spiritual goal. Um, Capitalism works not because we are saints, because we aren't saints. Yeah, yeah. It would be great to have intentional Orthodox communities. We're all so spread apart, but I would never want to force people to live in our community according to our standards. This is a big, big question. What to do, and I think I address it in the second part, which I'll read in just a few minutes. Uh, it took us a very long time to get into the situation that we find ourselves in, generations, and it'll take generations to find a healthier way. And the place that begins is within each of us, and then in our immediate communities, and it has to happen willingly, without coercion, within ourselves, within, certainly no coercion in a community. Things can't happen quickly, and I think cults arise because people want to have things happen quickly, and they can't. So I think returning to human scale living, is a good place to start. Moving out of cities back into villages. In the United States, we have lots of empty towns that are ripe for revitalization. I think a lot of creative things could be done, just going back to, slower, simpler, more communitarian living. I think that's totally possible, and preferable. And because of the internet, because of technology, like that's actually feasible for people that work remotely and stuff. And that's not a terrible thing. Eventually, maybe you do that. You go out to live in a village. You're closer to other folk. Maybe you start farming again. Maybe people will start farming again. And these are all things that could be done realistically, not in a weird way, but doing it with other people. Gardening, the Jews did that in Israel. They live in communes. Yeah, the kibbutzes. Gandhi set up communes like that too in India. Think of all the recent movements. All should be free to build intentional communities without the use or force of law. Yeah, it has to be volitional, without coercion. Can we imagine an ascetic government, maybe even especially a democratic one? Certainly not an authoritarian one unless it's benevolent. The Benedict option. Yes, well, I think probably the best governments in history were virtuous ones, and my understanding, I haven't read enough history especially with this kind of view as to what governance looked like, but apparently in the Christian East, and probably in the Christian West as well, there were a variety of different types of government, democratic to a certain extent, in old Russia, in the Balkans, at different times. They had, obviously we didn't have the kind of the nation states that we have today. They were much more localized, and some that actually were more democratic. So we have this two-party system in the United States, and we have this sense that you have to either be one way or the other. And clearly that's not true. There are a lot of different ways one could go about it. I keep coming back to the Amish. The Amish obviously have the virtue of being protected by the US government and the US Army. They can be pacifists. They can afford to be pacifists. So it's kind of a luxury that they have. But we have that luxury too. And we could actually create, live more intentionally. I haven't spent a lot of time with this website, Strong Towns, but a little bit. So I don't know if you're not familiar with it, it's worth checking out. Strongtowns.com or .org. But that's one of their focus. Their focus really is, what communities in the United States are building strong towns, and they have criteria for what that looks like. But it's kind of traditionally minded, and future minded too. It's not exactly nostalgic, but just focusing on the strength of community, and so they have a variety of criteria that they use. But the Benedict option, I don't believe in utopia as a breakdown because of human weaknesses. Yes, I don't believe in utopias either. I know that we can do better than what we're doing, and I've seen it. I've seen people do better. I've seen communities do better, and the vast majority of people just kind of, we go along with the status quo, and we intuitively know that there's a problem, but we can't change anything on our own. So we just kind of continue along. And at least for myself, I don't feel like that's, I want to live my life being pushed along and living in the suburbs in a way that is, to my mind, not according to how humans, should ideally live, and to try to do something better. Again, I think it's there's a limited amount of change that one can make personally, and certainly in a generation. But at least, I mean, the reason I'm doing all this is because I think that it's a conversation that needs to be had. There are enough people that see the problem, or at least intuitively know. And I don't think it's crazy. We certainly, one needs to be careful about being, utopian in one's ideas. But if one believes that there's an issue and has the capacity, the ability to leave, New York City or Chicago, wherever you are, and maybe with some friends go out and buy some inexpensive houses in a small town, and create another kind of life in a healthy way. I mean, it would definitely be countercultural, but there's no need to go out into the middle of nowhere and start a commune or something. There are, like I said, lots of underpopulated small towns in America. Human scale living was possible in the cracks, think Hebrews, between and in rural areas within all great empires. A world-spanning economic order seems to make that less possible, fewer cracks. Yes, yeah, yeah. Well, I spent about half my life overseas, so I also contemplate the possibility of not being in the United States. I'm not sure where I would end up trying to do this, but the world is still a large place, and maybe especially in a place like Alaska, one can find places that are further afield, I guess, in America. For those who do want to separate themselves, there are the monasteries. Yeah, if one can live that life, that's the problem. Is most of us aren't really cut out for that life. Thank you, Herman. We are on the same page. I'll check out the website. Very interested. Good. Well, I'm not sure who you are, Garden and Music, but I'm glad you're here. Audrey, a friend of mine who is a gardener, was helping me understand the danger of depending entirely on grocery stores for our food, since grocery stores are entirely dependent upon technology, which can fail. Yes. Well, this is another thing that people don't think about is how dependent we are on the grid. We are absolutely dependent on the grid. Here in the Carolinas, we had Hurricane Helene come in about a year ago, and we were without electricity for the better part of a week. And it was okay. They got the grid going again, and God bless the brave electricians who worked 24/7 to restore power and water and everything. But you could see how if the grid didn't come back, for a month or two, things could deteriorate for sure. And fortunately, it was September, so it wasn't cold. But if it had been in the middle of the winter or the middle of the summer, it could have been very, very unpleasant. And we are very fragile. We are very dependent. Every tool that we have makes us weaker. GPS has meant that lots and lots of people who otherwise could probably figure out how to get home cannot. There are lots of people that absolutely depend on their GPS to get anywhere, and that's a problem. That's a problem. It's a physical problem. I think it's also a spiritual problem. Literally, people don't know where they are. They are completely disoriented, and if you're totally dependent on your phone for navigation and you have no sense of direction at all. I mean, I know some people have less a good sense of direction, but uh, it's easy. It's easy to understand why people are so unmoored, because we are unmoored. But yeah, our food supply is we are very dependent. We are very dependent. Okay, well, this is great. This is great. Thank you so much. I was hoping that after a few of these live streams, there'd be more of a interaction, and I wish I could do this via Zoom, but then it wouldn't be public. And I want to make it, so that people who are not connected can find it. So sometime maybe we'll do a Zoom internally somehow, and then I can see all your faces. But this is okay. It's okay for now. Steve, reality gets in the way of the ideal. Anyway, good night, folks. Stability Talk. Thank you, Steve. Yes. It's important to be grounded and to not be overly idealistic. I think it's also important to be hopeful and to have some have a dream, have some kind of vision for some other way. Excuse me 1 minute. I will not be long. Sorry about that. All right, I am going to thank you again, Steve. Good night. I'm going to read the my second part here. Oh, well, hopefully it'll be interesting. In chapter 6, Kingsnorth addresses the myth of reason, the characteristically optimistic, modern, and romantic idea that if we could just strip away the accretions of history and superstition, that a virtuous and just society could finally be built. The following is Kingsnorth's response to the techno-optimism of Jeff Bezos. Quote, "It's always worth spending time with the unquestioned assumptions in passages like this. Here, for example," so Kingsnorth has just quoted Bezos's, something Bezos had written. "Here, for example, we see that our lives are, quote, ever improving, that there is a universal we in the, quote, developed world that can be, quote, improved with more, quote, growing, that the entire world wants to enjoy the American liberal capitalist lifestyle, that, quote, we can trust people like Jeff to, quote, make this planet better, that 1 trillion people is more, quote, interesting than 7 billion, that 1,000 Mozarts is a good target to aim for. Jeff doesn't say what we would do with all these extra Mozarts. Do we need that much classical music?" End quote. As Kingsnorth writes earlier in the chapter, quote, "There is a certain clear-eyed logic to Bezos's logic. This is the machine speaking, and if you accept the parameters of the conversation, there is a kind of naive purity to the argument," end quote. The problem, of course, is that most of us do not question the parameters of the conversation, which is why it can be so difficult to get clarity as to what is happening, and to begin to envision some kind of other reality. Gadfly Academy takes its inspiration from Socrates, who was put to death for questioning the parameters of the Athenian power structure. The path forward lies in questioning the basic assumptions upon which our machine culture is based. When we start questioning these assumptions, we find that many of the assumptions upon which we live our own lives also need to be questioned. Using the same machine logic against itself, one might ask the question, if we'd get an extra 1,000 Mozarts, wouldn't we also get an extra 1,000 Hitlers and Stalins and Oppenheimers with their nuclear bombs? Machine logic is that bigger and more is necessarily better, but each of us knows that in the real world, bigger and more is not always to be preferred. Here's another quote from the book. Reason, rationalism, individualism, market values, the rejection of the past, the framing of custom and history as obstacles, the idealization of progress and perpetual renewal. Jeff Bezos would recognize all of this and perhaps nod in vigorous assent. In the turmoil of the early 1790s, the new French elite were laying the foundations of the world we inhabit today. End quote. Because we were born into a post-revolution world, it can be difficult to appreciate the consequences of the revolution. The reality, however, is that we were born into a world that had already torn up its own roots. If we feel unmoored, it's because we have been unmoored since birth. We are living in the twilight of Christendom on the vapors of what was once a vibrant and cohesive, albeit flawed society. I was asked in our last live stream, once we see the problem, what can we do to make things better? One of the many difficulties with trying to make things better is that the situation we find ourselves in is one that has been hundreds of years in the making. Perhaps ours can be the generation where a critical mass finds as enough and actually changes the way we live. We live in a society of material abundance, but of meaning scarcity. One of the first steps in the process is to clarify our values and then to reprioritize our lives in such a way that we increasingly live according to these values. Here are a few things to keep in mind as one ponders the path ahead. One will be a long multi-generational process. It took us generations to get into the mess in which we find ourselves, and it will take us generations to get out of it. The path forward is one that will require patience, faith, and a clear vision. Two, it won't be easy. We are and will be swimming against the current. The first place that we will find it difficult is within ourselves. It's difficult to commit to and to live a countercultural life. In addition to the inner struggle, even those who share our vision will have their own inner struggle, which brings us to point number 3. Nothing good comes from coercion. Real love cannot be coerced, and deep inner change cannot be coerced. It's important to humbly acknowledge one's limitations and weaknesses while still striving towards one's ideals. There is therefore no place for inner coercion or for outer coercion. The traditional family structure provides a vision for this. In a healthy family, there is a tension between the individual and the community. Ultimately, each member of the family must have the freedom to choose or to reject their family. If we reject community, however, we should expect nothing other than the loneliness of individualism. 4, we can't do it alone. Humans need one another. That said, life in community is incredibly difficult and requires patient, virtuous people for community life to thrive. Frivolity and irresponsibility thrive in individualism, but just as they rot a person from within, so they rot a community. And then finally, 5, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. It's more effective to show people than to tell them. The greatest work each of us can do is within ourselves and then within our local community. If a small group of people is able to build something beautiful that incarnates a communal life inspired by non-machine values, this is much more likely to attract people than bare abstract ideas.